sensitive habitat areas, transportation metrics, which addresses some recent revisions to state law concerning the California Environmental Quality Act that essentially determines that in the future, the city would not be able to use traditional level of service as a means to describe transportation system impacts. And we'll get a little bit more into that as we review that topic. Historic resource management, which is something that we've gotten quite a bit of community input on and a lot of GPAC discussion concerning a potential approach for the future to historic resource management. Parking, particularly as it affects coastal access, and view sheds and viewpoints, and providing a mechanism to preserve or enhance those going into the future. So that's the range of topics. You'll see we had 16 different topics. Each of them is presented with a bit of analysis in the report that's before you that leads us to what we're terming key staff recommendations for each of these topics. With that, I'm going to transition to Amy, who's going to lead us through the first batch of these topics.
Thanks, Jeff. So as Mayor Irons said, we will take input after each of the key staff recommendations pages. And, well, I should say after each topic. Some of them we grouped onto one page. So, like Jeff mentioned, we worked with the staff and we took input both from the GPAC and from stakeholders who we met with this past fall as well, and formulated some recommendations. The full set of recommendations is in the report. We're going to highlight a few today because of our time constraints.
And I would just, for sort of mechanics of our discussion, as Amy indicated in the presentation, we're going to highlight some really kind of top level. The presentation itself doesn't itemize every recommendation. So what we'd like to do is in the presentation, we'll highlight those sort of very top level items, but as we pause for discussion on each of those topics, feel free to bring in any of the recommendations that you find in the paper for discussion.
Your question is based on the conflict of interest concern. As long as you're at the sort of global view, it's okay. You may want to turn your mic on.
Thank you. I know it's audible this way, but it wasn't sure it was recording or anything. We are recording? Okay.
Take your pause.
So, Nancy, are you there? So has this been recording for a while?
We've been getting audio since we walked in. As soon as that camera got set up, we've got a signal shot on it.
Okay, so I'll just do, since it's audio, and you're going to broadcast this, is that right?
Right.
So let me just read into the record kind of where we're at, because right now people are just listening to all this talk.
We didn't go live. We haven't.
I understand that. I guess if you're going to broadcast this, I just thought I'd read in the beginning of the meeting for that, just so when people are looking. So I'm sure people are listening to me just talk about that. So hi, everybody. You're listening to our audio meeting. This is a notice of a special joint meeting of the City Council and the City and the Planning Commission for the City of Morro Bay. It's Wednesday, January 11, 2017. Our meeting did start at 5:30. Apologize for the audio-visual technical difficulties, but we're just getting on live with audio, so this is going to be a recorded broadcast, and just wanted to announce that for the sake of the meeting. We do have a quorum of council members and a quorum of our Planning Commission, less Planning Commissioner Luer. Thank you. And we do have our staff here and consultants from Michael Baker Consulting that are in the audience, and maybe we just go through and identify yourself on the audio as we speak, and then we'll and maybe for audio as we get into questions and stuff, whatnot, we can identify ourselves on the microphone as we ask our questions, just for the record on the audio, and then council will do the same. And that's it for the announcement, and then we'll turn it back over to you, Amy, for pick up where we left off.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. This is Amy Sinsheimer from Michael Baker International, and we are going to start on the first topic, which is population growth. And we've highlighted one key recommendation under this topic. It is 1B, appropriate development capacity, and this is actually just one portion of that recommendation. I believe it has 4 bullet points. So one of the recommendations is the idea that because Measure F does currently limit population growth in the city, and this is a longer horizon plan, when the city does approach, if the city approaches 11,700 people, which is about 1,000 people more than the current population, this recommendation proposes that a process be initiated to either affirm Measure F and keep the cap at 12,200 people, or to possibly amend or repeal Measure F. So that is the one key recommendation we have, and we would be very interested in your input on that particular one or anything else in that section.
Okay, so we turn it over to the Planning Commission for comments, and then once you guys are done, we'll bring it back up to council. Thank you.
This is Michael Lucas on the Planning Commission. Amy, I was confused as to the numbers that we're looking at here. If we would look at the planning, the larger planning envelope that we're going to be considering in one of the future slides, do we know how many people are contained in some of those districts that in theory may come into the sphere of influence or even into the city with just in those districts that we've got identified?
That's a really good question. It's a fairly small number. I believe 3 out of those 4 areas, or 2 out of those 4 areas have very few population, but you're right, study area 2 is relatively populated and study area 4, so we could find that out.
I guess the other comment I had is that I know, if I'm not mistaken, SLO County's long-term plans are to encourage in the county areas growth near the existing urbanized areas. So it seems to be one of their thoughts that they would prefer people develop near the edge of our town. So that's the one thing I was thinking about, is the coincidence between potentially some of the areas that were under study as part of the plan and then future growth outside of our area that we may still have to provide services for, and how that works with these numbers that we're looking at here.
And I would, as part of an answer to that question, indicate the 12,200 person limit is in some ways independent of the land use plan. For example, if we're looking at a 25 to 30 year land use plan and we consider the range of uses that are identified on a map and what's the potential build out of those uses, that build out will, may well likely exceed 12,200. It's a different question than what's the growth cap of the city. And I think that's something to kind of keep in mind as we look at this, is we are likely looking at a land plan that would exceed 12,200, but it's a separate question, a separate policy question for the city, which is kind of why we have this 11,700 threshold, if you will, to say how rapidly do we want to achieve that build out. So it's more a pace of growth than necessarily an amount of growth question.
I guess the only comment I'd have is that I don't know the history of that ordinance, that piece of legislation, but my guess was it was a placeholder for some kind of accountability about infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And since we have so many pieces of infrastructure in play right now, that's one of the other aspects, is exactly which thing really leads, because one of the other things about the water use, for instance, if we retreat from some of the water sources and we look at the capacity of generating our own sources within the wastewater treatment plant, for instance, or restudy the capacity of the wells that it may replenish, how does that impact our capacity to serve? Because we could end up with an infrastructure that actually is challenged by that old number, or it could be something that we actually could take care of more than that quite easily because of the infrastructure. So I guess it's just one of those things that it always seems like they're all linked together, and you can't touch one without touching the impacts of the other.
When I first came across the proposition
Sorry. I was a little surprised. So I'd like to make sure, I sort of, following Michael's comments, that we understand that Proposition F is really sort of a signpost for the limitations on infrastructure and not some sort of a fiat imposed by city government to actually limit the population. I think clearly we know it isn't, but it might be misconstrued by some portion of the population.
Yeah, Richard Sadowski, Planning Commission. To echo what the two commissioners said about infrastructure, that same issue, that's one of my notes. However, also population growth is a derivative of jobs as well. And if we look at, when you're looking at population growth, are we integrating like commercial development, jobs? Because right now we have a lot of service industry and most of the job, in the restaurant, but, maybe integrating some other, maybe manufacturing or small manufacturing facilities and then bringing in jobs, and then that can help sustain sustainable growth.
Yeah. Yes, we are considering that. This measure and this number, I believe, are solely limited to population growth. But in the context of the plan, we are looking also at economic development, and I think there's an issue a bit later on about jobs housing balance as well. So yeah, those are also considered.
Bob Taft, Planning Commission. Just a couple of comments. In recommendation 1A, it indicates allowed for future growth, which is consistent with the community vision and values. And the community vision and value statement is an extraordinarily broad statement. I would really like to see this criteria made somewhat more specific. I would assume small town character and respect for the natural environment would be two of the major issues that would need to be considered. But I'd just like to see that spelled out a little bit more specifically. And then just a technical detail with regard to the Measure F issue. I would like to see eventually in the final document I'd like to see it specified as to how the population will be determined, since as you know, there's the American Community Survey and the California Department of Finance, and they're all several hundred apart usually. So there ought to be eventually a little bit of specificity with regard to that as well.
Okay, coming back up to council. So can you just repeat the question? So we're talking just about the population part of this section that you're on. Just kind of ask us exactly what you're looking for on this section.
So for example, on this issue, in the presentation, we've highlighted issue 1B. In the paper, there's 1A, 1B, 1C. So what it just
you want feedback on all three of those?
We would welcome feedback on all three. We've really sort of identified 1B as the one that we probably need the most feedback.
Okay. Red, would you lead us off, please? And I think we're still under microphone, so Red Davis? You just
I don't
identify
have
yourself.
Thanks.
Make sure we're on, because I think we're still just audio.
Yeah. I don't have anything.
Try it again. No? Nothing? Oh, okay. Here. You got it? Okay, good. Thanks.
I don't have anything to say.
Okay, all right. Well, don't turn the mic on then. Just kidding.
Matt Makowetsky, I do have one question in terms of 1B. I see these trigger points. In terms of this development capacity, what happens if the population doesn't reach these numbers? Is this just a moot point?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is what is has been the trend for, I believe, at least a decade and longer. So it's a slow-growing place recently.
Okay. Thank you. No, that's all comment I have.
Okay. I'll just go and then we'll just get that. So on 1A, the second bullet there, just for the sake of specific language, it says support growth that provides green jobs and new economic activities, creates high-paying jobs, et cetera, and then including working family jobs that allow upward mobility. At first, when I read, before I got to the rest of that, I was just thinking green jobs. I would think it would just be create jobs, period, and then economic activities. Certainly we want to see green jobs, but I didn't know if that was kind of discriminating one over the other. So I'm just, just a language thing, just comment on that. And then on the limit the amount of future growth accommodated by the plan more bay to level. So to accommodate the one water plan, so the first bullet under appropriate development capacity, just have a comment. So we're limiting the amount of future growth. We have a one water plan that's being developed in that. So is that something that should be help guiding us as that as well?
Yeah, that's a good point. And we do mention the one water plan in the next section.
Okay,
We can
all right.
add it here as well.
And then can you just, I just have a question on the build out on greater than current level of 1.07. Can you elaborate a little bit about that figure and what that means for me on the second bullet point?
Yes, so that's the jobs housing ratio, and I believe that is that there are currently more jobs than housing here. Not a lot more. That's not a hugely skewed ratio, but it's saying that we should kind of stay at that level or greater as we move forward.
And so the jobs housing ratio comes from HCD?
It's just a very easy calculation, dividing the jobs here in the city by the number of housing units.
Okay, I just wasn't sure if
So,
in our
like
housing
San Luis
element for
Obispo's-
HUD and things, there's some...
And it's largely an indicator as opposed to a policy. What we're doing with this potential type of recommendation is essentially this is a means of saying we'd like to encourage job growth, and as jobs grow, we'd like housing to essentially keep up, so that we don't wind up with a number that's skewed far below that value or skewed far above that value. Essentially, we kind of want to keep things the way they are, or slightly, or with a slight jobs trend.
Okay, those are my comments. Thank you. John?
Thanks. John Heading, City Council. So I just conceptually had this thought about growth, and my comments are around scale. And the comments or thoughts are this, trying to understand what are the scale requirements from a population standpoint to support the structure of a city to make it economically viable versus and if that's not adequate at the present level, given the current state of revenues and expenses, then, some idea of what scale is required to meet the economic needs to critically be a functioning city and be viable economically. And that to me is an extremely important consideration, because if you look at where we are at the present time with the limited ability to, I'll use the word diversify our economy right now, it's difficult to advance revenues, and a bit of growth in the right place and structured appropriately, I feel, is important to the city in order to command enough economic power to accommodate the structure economically of the city, if that all makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Marlis?
Marlis McPherson. As a new member and not having participated in the earlier sessions, I'm going to be allowed to ask some foolish questions, I assume. So the first one is, you've given a population here, and I just need to know where it came from, and then I'll explain why I'm asking that. I'm assuming it's a census data of some kind. Is that correct?
Yeah, it comes from the American Community Survey, which is a census product that occurs in between the 10-year censuses. So this one is from 2015, and those surveys have a smaller sample size and sometimes a larger margin of error than the decennial census.
Okay. And that would be then a measure of permanent residence in our city, is that correct?
Yes.
So the reason I ask the question is that we have so many, I don't know the exact number, but a number of houses that are owned by people who don't live here, and they only come occasionally, and we have several on the block that I live on. And I'm very curious to know how many people we could add to the city if all of those folks decided to retire here, which is their plan eventually. We could grow, it seems to me, just by virtue of how many unoccupied housing units we currently have. So I just wanted to raise that point. The other thing I wanted to mention was that I agreed with Dr. Teft that I think it's really important to kind of spell out in that section on the housing and job growth, the first bullet point, that it's consistent with the vision and values. And I think it's important that we know what that vision and values is and how it's tied to that exactly. So a little bit more detail there, perhaps. That's all.
Great, thank you.
Next issue.
And I just want to take a pause because we have two people in the audience for public comment. And so I was just going to, at the end, do public comment then. Hopefully that's okay with you all. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you. Our next topic is water supply. And we have highlighted one of the key recommendations, 2A, which is diversify water supply. And this includes diversifying through different methods. So you are already pursuing desalination as well as reclamation with your new facility. There are some other ideas here. And then also to make sure that that diversification is a key part of the One Water plan. So I think you're all aware of what that is. So we will open it up from there.
And we would welcome comments on 2A, 2B, or 2C.
Dr. Teft, Planning Commission.
Michael Lucas again. Got to be able to read my comments. I guess one of the things that I was confused about with the water policy is this expansion of the portfolio meant to eventually remove us from the state water supply? Because the economics suggest, I think that should be something that's more overtly stated, that's a goal. And then I know that the policies don't necessarily go down to the level of building codes, but it's staggering to me when I see the level of projects that come before us that have absolutely taken zero effort beyond the minimums in the state codes to address water use, especially in housing. The kind of costs that are going into some of these structures, they could easily have a gray water system without damaging the budget of the properties. And I would like to see us advocate that in addition to that's a form of conservation, I know, but it's not explicitly stated that way all the time, I don't think. But I'm all for the diversity that's shown there.
So I'm looking at my notes here. Well, I wanted to make sure that our improved and diversified water supply didn't. Maybe this is optimistic or whatever, but didn't significantly exceed the projected population. I guess what I'm getting at is that, in some sense, we're fortunate in that we have these sort of organic limitations to growth in Morro Bay in terms of infill land, even population, and certainly water supply. So I would hate to see the completed project create such a surplus that some of those organic limitations, indeed legally justifiable limitations, were no longer relevant, if you understand what I'm saying. And then my other comments have more to do with the practicality of trying to achieve this, so I have a feeling it's not really appropriate here, but it's sort of essentially with accurate cost estimation and the like. So that's it.
Richard Sadowski, Commissioner. The issue with the water supply, the diversity is good. We currently have a desal plant that's not quite yet went through the EIR or whatever it needs to do for the permitting process. So I think that should be something that's needs to be addressed like immediately. As a member of the WRFCAC, which is the Water Reclamation Facility Senate Advisory Council, it has recently come to my attention that we are not taking into account a couple of issues. And one of the issues is exfiltration rates in our sewer lines. And the reason why that is a significant issue is because that is directly related to what we reclaim in the plant when it gets there. The other issue is the surcharging of our infrastructure. As we are a tourist community, and our population here can, triple, quadruple, and so we want to make sure that we have a water supply or water storage supplies to be able to handle the during these huge surcharging events, or when we have a lot of when the restaurants are all full and the vacation rentals are full and the hotels are full. So I think that's something that is more of a technical a little bit, but something that we should kind of keep in mind. It was not in the too distant past that we almost ran out of water during one of these events here. So I just think that that should be integrated into the discussion, yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that we somehow need to prioritize a little bit. I think that there's a lot that we can do at this point to maximize supplies of water. We've got hundreds of thousands of gallons of water running down into the ocean right now that we could be capturing. And I think in terms of quality of life and in terms of preserving the environment, maximizing the water supply is a better option than conservation at a certain level. Obviously we don't want to be wasting water, but there's a point where it becomes less desirable. I would be opposed to seeing a particular reduction goal built into the general plan. I don't think there's enough flexibility there. What I would rather see is a mechanism by which the city will evaluate the water situation that it's in on a regular basis and enact the restrictions that are necessary, so that we're not necessarily, we're not glued to a 75 gallon per person. Maybe we need 150 gallon per person reduction. Maybe we need 50 gallon reduction. So I'd rather see a mechanism set up that can be determined as needed than a number written into the general plan. And I would echo Richard's comment that I think, I don't have an answer for this, but I think particular attention is going to have to be paid to how do we establish that water reduction goal, whatever it is, in a community where during the summertime, well over half of the population are not residents. Well over half of the water consumers in town are not residents here.
Okay, great, thanks. And we'll just keep going in the same order. Red, if you'll lead us off. And
Yeah, I just want to echo what Dr. Teff said about the conservation. I think it's too fine a point to choose particular numbered goals. We need to be flexible to meet conditions as they change.
One comment I'd like to make is on 2C in terms of restrictions. Looking at the restrictions, I think perhaps instead of just limiting them to the items in this paragraph, a more systematic restriction across the board from new construction to existing structures in terms of those restrictions, and then building upon what's already been said in terms of capturing that water, if possible.
okay, are we still on? We're just still on audio, right? Okay, I'm just looking for. We're all on. Okay, we're on. Okay, good. All right, thanks, Nancy. And so on 2C, yeah, just to piggyback a couple of comments. One on the 75-gallon comment per day, kind of the established rate, some sort of, that seems like Dr. Tepp mentioned that it needs to be somewhat flexible. I mean, that needs, locking something in. I think we've looked at other things in the general plan where we're locked in, and you're amending that. So it seems like why we're establishing that hard number. So some way we can have some parameters in how we develop that. And I just want to reemphasize some of his comments there. And then on the one bullet for establishing water efficiency landscape ordinance that exceeds state standards, and then adopt indoor efficiency standards for new construction that surpass standards of the state building. So I don't recollect the discussion that led to these two bullet points. What's wrong with the state standards, and why do we need to exceed them? Is it just because we want to? I mean, so there's nothing quantifiable there. I mean, it's great to be. I know I don't know what the state standard is, and I'm just reading this as exceed state standards. I don't know why we got to those state standards, and then I don't know why we want to exceed them, and exceed them by what. So I'm kind of looking for a little something there.
Well, first of all, I think it is based on some discussions that we had in some point of the input process. But for example, the state standards don't have restrictions for all residential developments. So one way to exceed them would be to have something that applies to all residential. So that would be one example.
Okay, so maybe I think you've got my comments. I'm sure that'll work out. Those are good. John?
So one of the policy implications that I was thinking about with regard to this issue was, we're a tourist, economically driven community, and one of the attractions to the community are the various amenities around the community, not only the bay and the ocean itself, but the topography and the natural landscape. And I've noticed recently a bit of a decline due to the need to try to balance water use in terms of restrictions, and not possibly adequately being able to maintain the so-called landscaping and natural topography of the community. And so from a policy standpoint, somehow I think there has to be a balance and an allowance for determining how to mitigate that and not allow things to occur like some of the signs that I see on some of our hotels where they're not watering lawns, and I get that, but it detracts from the overall attractiveness of that as an entity. Beyond that, I think some of our natural areas that do require irrigation and or watering, we have to make allowances for that to not see a decline in that natural beauty. So how you balance that, I don't know, but from a policy standpoint, I really think that's critically important.
I just want to make a couple comments. First of all, the issue about whether or not we're trying to go off the state water project, we have not made that as a policy decision at all. In fact, if anything, it would be closer to say we are interested in decreasing our reliance on the state water project. So we do want to diversify, but this is an area where I think Morro Bay has really made a lot of progress. And so we're already on the right track here. But it could be the case that we stay on the state water project and actually sell it to other people, depending on the economics involved. So I wouldn't emphasize that we intend to go off the state water project. The other thing to keep in mind, I think, is that you've got a large emphasis on conservation, and we have really demonstrated here in Morro Bay that we can conserve. We have, I think it's the lowest water use in the county per capita. So the danger in too much of a reliance on conservation is that if you go below a certain point, you have to raise water rates just to pay for existing facilities. And that's a hard sell for the public to raise water rates because they've conserved too much. So again, it's a balance. Just want to make that point. We've talked about it before. Thanks.
Good comments.
Okay, moving on to number 3. I'm sorry we don't have the presentation up for this one because the map is pretty colorful, so some of you hopefully have a color printout. So Jeff alluded to this earlier, and what we are discussing so far during this process is the idea that there could be a larger area outside of the city limit that is in Morro Bay's purview, and there are different ways that that could occur. So on the map, we have 4 areas identified as study areas 1, 2, 3, and 4. And within Area 1, which is the northernmost area, there is a sub-area that's closer to the city limit that is called the proposed sphere of influence. So I'm happy to take questions about the details of each of those areas. I'm not going to get into each one of them now, but the idea is that you could choose through the general plan and local coastal plan process to adopt this planning area, and it wouldn't be annexed, but it would be more of interest to the city officially. My understanding is you would receive notification from the county, or the county would be aware of Morro Bay's interest, and so therefore would share information about things that are happening in that area, and you would have more of an official interest in that way. It's not a land use decision-making interest. If you did decide to potentially annex or include areas in your sphere of influence, then that would go through the LAFCO process and then perhaps become part of the city. And that is, we've designated this area in study area 1 as possibly more likely or more of interest, at least to discuss tonight and as we move forward. So I'm going to leave it there for now, but we can discuss this more in the question and answer. So for 3A, we have the recommendation to establish the planning area as identified in the figure. And then for 3B, it would be to actually identify that criteria that would be used when future SOI expansions did occur and annexations. There also is a lot of this area is potentially proposed, based on what we've heard from the public and from the GPAC, to be placed under conservation if it was brought into the city. So we have that element in 3B as well. And I will open it up to questions.
Okay, great. Planning Commission.
Michael Lucas again. I'm all for studying anything that has an impact on us. I think the tract that you said was of the least study value, I think, was the one shown in green, which was number 2. And even that one, though, one of the sites that was looked at for the wastewater treatment plant has a failing septic system that we know could impact the aquifer there, which still, I imagine, in our diversified water portfolio is counting on some of those wells. So there's something that could have a negative influence, and I think some of these things, as you note, have a positive influence by bringing them in. So I'm all for broadening the study area, all of those areas. I think it takes into account all 3 of our major streams that impact the image of the city and completes the work up to Cayucas so that we have a better idea of how we would prefer to see that develop.
Joan Gracia, Planning Commissioner. I also like the idea that there will be additional sets of eyes, be they individuals or government entities, looking at these properties in terms of safeguarding, conserving, and making the best use of the lands. And I suppose because of that, we should have some sort of coherent and standardized way of deciding if some of these properties should be included in the sphere of influence or even annexed. So, on balance, I think it's a very good thing. However, and this is just more of a policy consideration, is that in terms of, I'm thinking I'll probably be stating the obvious in terms of annexing these tracts look large to me, and again, I'm only speaking of the instance where we might decide to bring a certain tract of land in the city bounds. These are large tracts, and they will look very attractive to developers. And in my career, I've been very much aware of the influence that developers can bring to a community, vis-a-vis the public relations and lobbying and legal resources, and in that, in conjunction with probably the continuing needs of the city for revenue, make for an interesting competition. And I guess what I'm suggesting is just a caution. It's very difficult to resist those kinds of influences, and to annex a sizable piece of property within the city could be a very tempting proposition. So just a caution.
Richard Sadowski. I have a question for whoever can answer it. Several years ago, under Mayor Peters, there was a meeting, and I happened to go to it, and the LAFCO executive director came in, and basically Morro Bay got their sphere of influence stripped quite significantly by LAFCO, and the reasoning behind it was that the argument that the executive director from LAFCO said was that we don't have the money to develop it. And then when one of the council person asked him, and he also stated there's no appeal process. Can I get a little, or can we get a little clarity on how that works out?
That's excuse me. That's essentially what happened. LAFCO does a sphere of influence review. They're supposed to do them every 5 years, but I think the last time they did it was back in 2007. And so when they looked at it, we didn't. I was meeting with LAFCO because we're in the process of doing our sphere of influence review right now, and I met with them last week. And so it looks like the city's original sphere, it went well out almost to the boundary of Atascadero. And it was based on, from what LAFCO Executive Director David Church was saying, it was based on watersheds. And so when the LAFCO board looked at it, they said, when they were looking at all the cities, they were trying to, I don't know, constrain the enthusiasm for how far they were going out with their spheres, and they pulled them back in for several of the cities, and even some of the community services district areas of interest. They pulled some of those back in as well. And so that's why they did it. They sort of made the finding that the city didn't have the resources to annex and serve, those areas outside, and so it ended up basically snapping our sphere of influence line to our city boundary line. Okay? We've had conversations, like I just indicated, with LAFCO about some of the information that's provided in here, planning area information related to things we have interest in. We do have an existing memorandum of agreement with the county about things that happen in this area and how we process projects and how we interact with one another and notice one another. I'm in the process of amending that right now, and we're bringing that to council probably in a couple of months. And we look at our municipal services review. We're looking at that as well. And so we're looking at both of those components. And we have, again, had conversation with LAFCO, and they don't have any, at least heartburn at this point right now, with us showing an expanded sphere of influence in our in the area identified in underneath our current memorandum of agreement with the county and LAFCO. Mirrors what's on here in the red in Area 1. It does go and pick up most of the Chevron parcels, because that was of interest back when we did the last review, which is back in 2007. We were looking at those parcels and thought that could be something that the city would have interest in, and so it was included in there back then. So we're really just doing more of that and being a little more specific, and maybe if development were to be focused related to some of the parcels that are out there, because Chevron's looking to divest themselves of those, we would want to maybe potentially have some control over what that looks like, and where those things would be located, hence the sphere that you see, or the potential sphere that you see shown in that exhibit. Does that answer your question?
I'm glad that that the staff has a pulse with the county on what's going on there. Yeah, thank you. And I too like the having that sphere of influence out is a good thing for a couple of reasons, especially Area 1, where, correct me if I'm wrong, but right, like if there's that little hash mark right there on the northern part of where it says Morro Bay Sphere of Influence, and it has a hash mark, and then that's on the beach there, right? And then on the other side is where there's a lift station 5, as Cayuga Sanitary District's lift station, and I'm under this understanding that is still within the city limits. And being that we have that in the city limits, we could potentially have the infrastructure to, as far as the sewer collection infrastructure, to help support that, but that would have to be verified. Other than that, that's all my comments. Thanks.
Just a couple of things. The Section 3B covers a pretty broad range of possible actions, SOI expansions, annexations, development, and conservation projects. One of the things that I would like to see as this moves forward, and I realize we're not to that degree of specificity yet, but I'd sort of like to see for each one of these an indication of the level of planning that would be required in order to make that happen, in order to do that. Certainly, for annexations, I would like to see a specific plan before any annexation would take place. And the other thing I would like to see put in at some point is just a flat prohibition on leapfrog development. I mean, that is the definition of urban sprawl, and that's not why we're doing this.
Red?
Planning Area 3 is governed by Measure H, and I don't see any mention of that in the plan. That was a 1990 measure that restricts any development within that acreage to 13 commercial acres. I think that's something that's really important to include.
The area that you're talking about, where that measure applies, is actually inside city limits. These things that are shown on the map are outside city limits.
Oh, thanks.
So just for clarification. Yeah, that's we're talking about, that's Tri-W. The portion of Tri-W inside the city is where that measure applies. And then we have the portion outside the city limits, which is where one of the preferred alternatives for the WRF is.
Thank you. That's all I have.
No questions? Let me just go through my notes. I don't think I have any questions either. I'll turn it over to John. Thanks.
So I agree with Area 1 and the comments you've made with regard to that. It would be interesting to get a sense of, and I think it was mentioned by a couple of other folks, the potential infrastructure costs for getting infrastructure to the area there specifically. And, I think excluding area potentially 2 and 4 might be desirable, but I'd like to keep it on the radar screen. And the comment about potentially other areas, I do agree. We should keep watching in general for that potential. So, no other comments. Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to follow up a little bit on this whole issue of what might be required for including these areas in the planning area versus sphere of influence. And is there an assumption that if you want it as in your sphere of influence that you eventually want to move to annexation, or not?
So that's a good question. If you put something in your sphere of influence, it's kind of an interesting process that can go along with it. It does sort of indicate that you're willing. It's why, I'm going to back up there, it's why you want to put really specific policies in relationship to what you're doing in your sphere of influence to tell the story of exactly what can happen out there. Because what can happen is people that own property inside of the sphere can go directly to LAFCO and make an application to annex. They don't have to go through the city of Morro Bay to do that if it's in our sphere. Would LAFCO be really willing to allow that to happen if the city was not interested in it? Probably very unlikely, but they can. There's not a requirement that they go through the city of Morro Bay to answer that. So that's why we want to have very specific policies related to anything that would expand our sphere beyond where we're at right now, which is, kind of why some of these the areas where we are suggesting maybe we want to expand the sphere, that's going to be really for preservation and conservation purposes for the backdrop of our city.
Okay. And just a follow-up question. Have you had any negotiations or discussions with the county about whether or not they would like to have us take over or have a sphere of influence in some of the county areas?
I've spoken both with county representatives and LAFCO. And at this point, at least the preliminary point where we're at right now, we're going to be probably including this area in the memorandum of agreement that we will have with the county and LAFCO. That'll be brought back before the council probably within, again, the next couple of months. And it'll allude to, probably that we're going through this process of the general plan and LCP update, and we'll be, nailing these things down. And as those things come forward, an example might be that we identify the area, if one of the alternative sites or preferred alternative for the WRF, the city council actually chooses the site officially after we've done the environmental review and so forth, that could come into the sphere automatically. We've been talking about that to avoid kind of one of the steps that would be necessary to annex. So those are the types of conversations that I've been having with the county and with LAFCO.
Thank you. And so I just want to second Dr. Teff's recommendation that we have a really clear understanding of the level of planning that's involved with each planning area versus sphere of influence versus annexation.
Great.
Okay, number 4 is economic development. And the two key items that we've highlighted are 4A, which is to incorporate economic development considerations in the land use plan. And then 4C, to make energy and telecommunication technology resources readily available to businesses. And we do have several other recommendations in there for your consideration as well.
Okay, looking for the Planning Commission.
With Michael Lucas again. I really like the idea of an economic development consideration or impact. I think that's something that's been kind of missing. We tend to look at things in an aesthetic point of view, and how those things flush out, I think, would be fascinating. And I was the one thing that isn't on the slide here is this idea of a community financing district, and I wonder if you could explain that a little bit as to what that means. That's the last bullet on 4A in the big text.
So it's, in some ways, it replaces redevelopment, which I don't believe Morro had, but at least recently. But it's the idea of raising funds locally in order to redevelop certain areas or revitalize certain areas.
It's a process that the governor, gosh, what is it now, about 2 years ago, recently reintroduced in the wake of the sort of disillusion of redevelopment. Mm-hmm. One of the tools that was available under redevelopment is something called tax increment financing that essentially allows an area to essentially impose an assessment, a property tax assessment on themselves, and then the revenue from that property tax assessment is directed back to that area. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what this process would be establishing a mechanism where districts or areas could elect to participate in that type of process.
Just for clarification, and it didn't mean that the property tax would be increased. Right. The same amount of property tax would be paid, it's just who it goes to.
Thank you.
The only other thing I had in there is this idea of the telecommunication technology, because we've had quite a bit of discussion in the last few years, actually, on the proliferation of kinds of technology that I think some of us are very concerned have gotten out of hand without our ability to control where it's located. And so by blanket endorsing telecommunications technology, if you're talking about burying fiber optic, I'd say, yeah, let's do that. If it's the kind of proliferation of cell phone towers and facilities and rights of way in residential areas, I think we've got a lot of discussion about that.
Joan Graff, your Planning Commissioner. I am in complete agreement when it comes to the telecommunications build-out, and I'm certainly cognizant of the number of applicants that have come to us and the problems associated with that. But I have to say, in terms of the recommendations here, in principle, I see no objections. Of course, everything is in the details, but I find these recommendations worthy.
Yeah, when we listen to different Verizon or whoever comes in with a cell tower, one of the things that we really need, right, straight up, is a map, is the data, what we have here right now, and have that as a baseline. And we don't have that right now. And we have these applicants come in, and they have FCC this, but FCC doesn't have jurisdiction over public health. As a planning commission, that's what we are about, is the people, to make sure that it's publicly health and safety. And so the telecommunication, I'm not opposed to it. It's just that we need we're building infrastructure, but we don't have the tools, the staff didn't have the tools, and we don't have a plan. It's a problem. And then as far as the energy, I think that, we should really work on the solar part of, that's part of the building and planning, and having a means to make using, like having the meters that are solar ready and that kind of stuff. That should be all integrated part of it. Not necessarily a centralized generating renewable source, which could be, but also decentralizing as well. Thanks.
Couple of things, well, a number of things, actually, guys, with this chapter. The first thing I have to object to is some of the information and tone in this section, because, this makes it look like Morro Bay is a low-income community, and it is not. For example, under head of household jobs, it says 51% of employed residents work in either the retail trade or the accommodation and food service sectors. That's not true. 22.5% of our population work in those two sectors, and those numbers are statistically not different from the state as a whole. What we have is we have a lot of jobs in those sectors in town, but the majority of those jobs are not filled by Morro Bay residents. They are filled by people who live outside of the city. It says that our household income was 17% below the state average, and that is true, okay? But our family size is also 17% below the state average. So when you look at per capita household income, we are equal to or above the state in both per capita household income and per capita family income. If you look at poverty rates in Morro Bay, the poverty rate in Morro Bay is 25% lower than the state of California. The poverty rate for children in this city is 60% below the state average. Okay, so we've got to get over this concept of Morro Bay as being a low-wage community. The residents here are not low-wage residents. In terms of the recommendations, and this actually was discussed at GPAC. What we're writing here, we're writing a general plan for the city of Morro Bay. We're not writing a business plan here. We're not writing a general plan for the businesses of Morro Bay. And this economic development section needs to address economic issues that affect the residents as well as the business community. Two of the essential ones are affordable housing, okay? Because 50% of our renters are in housing that is not affordable. 1/3 of our residents who are buying houses with a mortgage, their housing is not affordable. They're spending more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. And that we're not going to build our way out of that. Improving those figures is going to require a deliberate strategy on the part of the city, and that needs to be in the general plan. The other area that I think is essential that we address in terms of the future, because it's a growing problem, is homelessness. The 2015 point in time count found 91 homeless people in the city of Morro Bay. That's almost 1% of the population. And out of those 91 homeless people, 87 were unsheltered. They had no shelter whatsoever. We need to address that. That is an issue that is not only a national issue, not only a statewide issue, but it's a local issue here in Morro Bay.
Red? The community financing district, how does that differ from a business improvement district?
We can confirm, but we're pretty sure that a business improvement district is not from property tax.
No, the business improvement district is that area. It's like your T-bid. That's sort of what a business improvement district is. It's a area that you assess an amount. People choose to be assessed an amount of money.
Right.
And that money is then spent to be used only for those operations and things associated with the people who pay the money, who pay the assessment.
Yes.
A CFD is a mechanism where the city is able to have an area that there's agreement on the area being formed, and once it's formed, any property tax increases in that area comes to the city. You have to share it with other entities too, but an amount of the taxes comes to the city, and then the city can use that for all sorts of economic development purposes, from assisting businesses getting up and running, building new buildings, putting in public infrastructure. So it provides much more opportunities for the city to have cash to be able to do something with.
Is that cash constricted to the CFD geographic area?
It has to be something that's going to benefit the CFD. So if it's a sewer line going in somewhere, the sewer line may not always just be in the CFD area, but it's going to benefit the CFD area.
Okay.
It could be an off-ramp that's nearby to be able to get traffic in and out of the CFD.
Okay, so there is a difference. So I wonder if we could include business improvement districts in that section. Thanks.
And I have a question for 4A, in terms, it says incorporate economic development considerations. Is it plausible to put some sort of specificity in there in terms of what kind of economic development consideration business, allowable businesses? I don't know if that's applicable to that. That's my question.
Can you clarify what you mean by allowable businesses?
Yes, in terms of going in a larger sense in having these large areas in terms of the municipality, do you say we have in certain areas we have economic development considerations, and within those considerations be specific, i.e. that in terms of developing a larger economic outlook, development outlook, you want to attract certain businesses. So then do you be more specific for certain areas to attract those certain businesses, be them retail, light industrial, or something like that? Does that make sense?
It does, and that is accomplished through a combination of policies such as this, as well as land use designations, or essentially what designations and what zoning do we apply to property that then isolates areas and a group of uses and pairs those, and then it's implemented further through things like an economic development strategic plan that would say, for a duration of time, these are the things that we're emphasizing in terms of attraction and retention.
And so for those three groups, do you need a larger order of specificity here to say, delineate exact what kind of businesses, or is it that's fine to do that, and then those other bodies will work together to develop that?
I would suggest the latter, because again, this is intended to be a bigger picture 20, 30-year plan, and I think we would want to leave the details of what's emphasized in timeframes to the strategic plan and what's for certain locations to the zoning.
Okay, thanks. Just on 4B, adopt business-friendly practices, all good stuff. An ongoing, I guess, question here when we talk about that, I think pretty vague in general, because we really don't have a policy that defines what business-friendly is. So I'm just going to throw out that as far as for discussion on how we move that forward. John?
So I think that the economic development considerations are really going to be predicated on significantly the ability to fund them, and so I think we've been talking around it, but what Mr. Pannoni, I believe, was referring to were EIFDs, and that's the financing mechanism that has, quote unquote, been the vehicle to replace the redevelopment agencies that no longer exist. And so I think the exploration of that zone should be considered, and the boundary for such a zone. because that could be city, it could be county-wide, or it could be an area within a city. And so there are requirements for EIFDs, but without a significantly well-defined funding mechanism, it's going to be very difficult to attract, recruit, retain, et cetera, and expand infrastructure. Two, somewhere in there, I think we need to talk about the quality of the protoplasm, and by that I mean, when we talk about retail and retail development, what is it and what kind and what level? Because if you look at our price point in Morro Bay versus the price point in terms of sales in communities like Carmel, and I'm not saying we're going to be a Carmel and or a Monterey or an area like that, but our price point is probably somewhere in the area of about 25% of the price point of those areas, and therefore sales tax revenue will never approach those areas. And I think that has to do not so much with expanding significantly retail, but looking at the kind of retail that we make available to not only our visitors, but also the members of our community. And the last part for me is really identifying the opportunities for business clusters. And so if you look at green-related business, something like biopharmaceutical companies require, certain facilities that are clusters that could be very beneficial, and for communities like Morro Bay, they're very excited about coming here because of quality of life. And so San Diego has been a hub for the development of huge biopharmaceutical industry. So I think cluster development and identification first, and then possibility for development would be important as well. Thanks.
I think most of my questions have been answered along the way here. The one thing that I was thinking about was the almost total lack of office space in Morro Bay. And I don't know what we can do about that, but I know that it's very difficult if you're a small business to find a vacant office in Morro Bay. And I don't know how we encourage that, but I just didn't see any mention of it in here. So otherwise, everybody else has asked the questions I had. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, number 5, neighborhood compatibility. So again, we have just 2 of the key recommendations here. One is to create design guidelines with clear intent that balance restrictions with flexibility. So this is building on what's already happened with your interim design guidelines. And most of you are probably aware, but I should note that in the downtown waterfront strategic plan, there are design guidelines for the downtown and waterfront that are under development now. And then 5D, establish neighborhood boundaries that may be used for future land use planning and design efforts. So in the background report for this plan, there are neighborhood boundaries. And so if those become finalized at the end of this plan, then that would be one tool moving forward for other standards and guidelines could be based on those different areas of the city. And we will take questions.
Okay, I just want to do a little time check. So it's been an hour and a half, and we're on neighborhood compatibility number 5. We've got, a total of 16. So either we're going to get to a point where we want to concede and just say we've got as far as we can, and we'll, establish another meeting. So just want I'm looking at some feedback from you, Scott, and our consulting staff on where we want to go with this.
I guess it would be great if we could maybe speed up comments a little bit, if possible, and see how many we can get through. That would be that's the best course of action, is see how many we can get through, and then we'll make decisions from there.
There you go.
With a maybe supplemental point of, we will always welcome written. I think, understanding there's benefit to discussing these things in the meeting format. If there are additional comments that you feel are maybe something that would be better expressed in written format to staff, that's also material we would accept.
Okay, great.
Just be sure you send this just to staff.
Correct, just to staff.
I'm sorry?
Just be sure you send those comments only to staff, not to your...
Not copy
Correct.
to everybody. Perfect. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. Michael? Mr. Lucas?
I don't think we're going to be brief on this one. The neighborhood.
That's why I brought it up at this point right here.
Let's be brief.
I think it's really interesting. It seems very odd to me the way the retail, so-called, is packaged in with the residential, because, as Councilperson Heading was saying, we have this sort of clean light industrial that when you say retail doesn't necessarily ring a bell. And so this idea of creating districts and neighborhoods that have different criteria, I think, is absolutely critical. It's too geographically and context diverse here, I think, to blanket it with one set of recommendations. And, aside from that, I would just say it concerns me to see the identification of chains as something. I think the idea of size is a way to talk about the problem more than chains per se. There's probably small chains that might do fine and big chains that might do fine, but there's a certain building size that invites a certain kind of chain that I think starts a reaction that could be negative. So I'm more comfortable looking at zones and gross square footage, and I think the idea of differential floor area ratios within the districts is a really strong idea, and I'll limit it to that.
And I will try and be brief as well. With respect to the voluntary guidelines or mandatory standards, I think if you're going to have standards, they should be mandatory. I mean, we should put some skin into the game. That recommendation 5B, where it talks about varying the size of the second floor, I would like to see some language in that gives consideration to neighbors behind them in order to preserve some of the ocean view for neighboring properties. So rather than just setting back properties to break up the mass of the structure, some consideration for sharing the view. Commissioner Lur's comment about the chains is very interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. I was simply thinking of placing the burden on chains to demonstrate that the various criteria listed in the recommendations are proven. Place the burden on them rather than making it an argument or placing the burden on anyone who's opposing them. And then finally, with establishing the neighborhoods, I like that idea, but I'd like it not to be any sort of fiat from above. I was thinking perhaps of giving them the opportunity to form neighborhood advisory committees that might sort of grow up organically and sort of work out their own boundaries and have a certain buy-in to the whole proposition, and at the same time avoid any perception of elitism. That's it.
On the neighborhood compatibility, I like the FAR, the floor area ratio thing. And with the new chain stores, the only thing when we look at some of the chains, the designs are like corporate designs. They're, the templates, and I think that sometimes they're kind of a turnoff, not to say that, if they're, they have other ideas, but not these templates. And one of as far as neighborhood boundaries, I think we have to, integrate with, and then this kind of goes back to economic development and everything else. I feel that, we should not only look at retail, but also, business to business areas where we have commercial areas like on North Main Street and areas like that where we could kind of open up, kind of like what's going on at the old Sun Bulletin building. There's a business there, and it's a business, kind of business to business thing, kind of in that kind of genre. And as far as as far as writing in comments, for me, it's a little easier when it's organic, because you can play off the people when you talk. So, if it was up to me, it'd be maybe another meeting. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, but that's just talking.
Well, I would certainly like to second Michael's suggestion that the design standards really, there may be some overarching principles that would apply citywide, but in order to develop guidelines that are really going to be effective, they're going to have to be broken down to the neighborhood area. It's just the topography is too diverse, the existing lot sizes are too diverse. So I just see that as being the only workable way to do it. I would not be in favor of prohibiting chain stores because, I think some of our most dynamic businesses in town, I love Miners and Limos, and, they're small chains, but they are chain stores. But I do think there are areas where we do not want them. Obviously, to throw it out there, the downtown and the Embarcadero come to mind immediately. So I would be in favor of limiting where they're permitted. The size thing, I don't know. There's small chains. There's chains that fit into small stores like McDonald's, for example, and there's Costco. So they can be. I don't know if that would be an effective way to deal with the situation. I would not. I like the general idea of defining business size. I don't think at this point I would commit necessarily to FAR or to a particular method. We need to develop that as we go along. I'm not also not very fond of allowing increased height in the downtown at this point because number one, I think that height profile is part of the neighborhood character of our downtown. That number one, and number two, I see an awful lot of buildings in the downtown where the second story is not being utilized as it is. So it's not I don't think the need is there because I don't think the existing height allowance has been fully utilized so far.
I'll pass on my comments.
Matt? Okay. Just have a few comments and then move on. Just for clarification, when we talk about creating design guidelines, I feel as though the design guidelines there are to implement the compatibility altogether. So when I see the line that says limit or prohibit new buildings that are clearly inconsistent with Morro Bay, I would say that I would say strike that because our design guidelines just need to be in there. I appreciate that. And then some of the things about, as we talk about FAR, some of the issues, we do have a lot of non-conforming structures neighboring other structures. So just want to be sensitive on some flexibility. If you have a new project that's going up that's completely conforming, we shouldn't have a non-conforming structure, neighboring structure dictate a completely conforming structure. So just made some comments there. And then on multi-use zones, I don't know how this for neighbor compatibility, but some of the multi-use zones, ensuring that they're utilized for multi-use instead of converting a multi-use lot into a larger single-family structure and making sure that we're getting the most out of those. Those are my only comments. John?
Yes, just some quick comments. One, for me, one of the keys to affordable housing in Morro Bay, if there is such a thing, is size. And I think somehow, somewhere, there needs to be designation for allowances of smaller units, maybe even portable units. And my gosh, I know that's going to stir up a lot of stuff, but building 5,000 square foot homes versus 800 square foot homes, you see the affordability variance there. Two, I think that visual examples in your guidelines are going to be helpful. I'm a visual, and I think a lot of people are, and as you develop your compatibility guidelines, the more visual examples that are incorporated in, the better. My third comment is There's something interesting to me about a mixed retail residential area, and I don't just mean retail bottom, residential on top, but courtyards intermingling with retail entities and small residences that are cottage-like. There are areas like that that might be incorporated. That's appealing to me. Thanks.
Yeah, I want to just second what you just said, John, especially about affordability of housing. I know I attended one of the workshops, and I was disturbed that I wasn't allowed to talk about housing because it wasn't supposed to be a main element in the plan. And I think that housing is such a key issue here in Morro Bay, and I understand we have a housing element, but I think that for sure the design guidelines have to take into account the fact that we do want to make sure we have affordable housing, and that means smaller houses and teeny houses and a range of options. So that's my comment.
Great, thanks.
Great. Moving on to multi-generational community. This is a topic that is unique to Morro Bay. We don't see this in every general plan, key issues, and we have two key recommendations here. One is to provide, through the general plan and also the implementation in the zoning, for multi-generational living spaces. So places that are suited for folks of many different ages in terms of the way they are designed, but also the idea that there could be spaces where people of different generations live together. And then also to make sure that those living spaces, or that there is a way for those living spaces to be located within easy access of services and community facilities. So that's 6A. And 6D is more the big picture idea that we would shape the land use to support that multi-generational community. So we also welcome your comments on the other key recommendations, and we'll be back to the Planning Commission.
I just want to say I really appreciate this section, and I totally endorse the last few comments on the last section we talked about, because it's very frustrating to be at a major employer of the area and see people not be able to choose to work for a wonderful place because they can't afford to live here. And this idea of multi-generational communities, also, single-parent families and the infrastructure of childcare and things like that. So when I read through this, the implication is sort of servicing the elderly at a higher level, and perhaps some of the single people. But I think there's single-parent families and things like that. Those are the people. I think we used to have 2 schools that functioned here for elementary schools, and it's down to 1. And in that 10,000, 12,000 people, I think it would be a different community if we saw more mixing across the generational demographics.
Certainly the multi-generational arrangements are essential going forward. The only thing I would add is some mention of parking, so that in our quest to allow more people to group together, we don't inadvertently crowd the city and make it more convenient for parking congestion than is necessary. Now, I'm not quite sure how to go about that. Maybe just include it as a consideration, but I would add that.
I too like this section, and as people get older, the children playing, it's like a beautiful noise, and so you can have and it's tied into affordable housing. It's directly linked to that, and that's where you have a little smaller one or studios or one bedrooms, and where you can take care of some of the elderly. I like the concept, and I think that I think it's let's just say it's an important part.
I'll just say I can pretty much endorse this section, and I look forward to seeing how some of these concepts flesh out as we move forward.
Red? I think a big part of supporting multi-generational community is medical support. And I think we should develop an element in here. Our city at present has virtually no family practice, no pediatric, no gerontology. All of those are essential for multi-generational.
All right, I would say I completely endorse this. It's a great section. Yep, absolutely. John?
I endorse it. It's the key to health, one of the keys to health. One of the things that I just wanted to add is that, as one transitions from single-family homes to condo living to assisted living with some help with activities of daily living, those function well in the area that is close to the downtown. And the example I give you is if you think about the Man's House in San Luis Obispo, where one might live in a social setting that allows them to still be ambulatory and have access to shopping, retail, theaters, etc. I just think it really promotes one's quality of life and life in general. So the incorporation of assisted living units in that area, which traditionally you put them up on a hill somewhere away, I don't think it's a good concept doing that, putting them away, but incorporating them into an area where people can be active is extremely important. Thanks.
Yeah, I fully support this section of the report. I'm just curious to know how you go from what we currently have to a completely different sort of built environment where we're talking about supporting it. So I'll be very curious to see where you go with this next.
Thank you. Number 7 is coastal access. This is one of the required coastal commission topics, and we've only pulled out one key recommendation here, but there are several. And this one is to improve lateral connections along the Embarcadero and to coordinate with property owners in that process. And as some of you may know, this is already something that the city has received funding to study, so that will be part of this planning effort. And we are open for questions.
I think this is fun. I think I see this incrementally changing the last few years I've been involved with the commission. The main thing I would say is the way that this fleshes out with the North Embarcadero, where things are still kind of up in the air.
I also am very enthusiastic about this aspect of the plan. I would add, I'd like to see some design guidelines included in this, or rather the need to develop some design guidelines as they relate to lighting and paving material and access signs and making it clearly on notice that people have access to these things.
Yeah, I think this is one of the key things, well, one of the key reasons why the Coastal Commission was created was, you go to Hawaii and there's I've talked to people there and they wish they had a Coastal Commission. There's like ice, just develop, view sheds are gone, privatized. That said, can I just ask you, this California Coastal Trail, does that have anything to do with the bike trail between here and Cayucas, or is that something different?
Yes, that is considered part of the California Coastal Trail. So the California Coastal Trail is something that many parts of California have done the planning effort for, but it isn't necessarily implemented everywhere, and it can be implemented in many ways. It can be via bike path, pedestrian path, separated pedestrian path. In some places, like in Big Sur, there will never be anything but the side of the highway, because that's the only thing that exists. So it isn't, the idea isn't that there's one pathway all the way up the coast of California that someone can walk on. The idea is that there is a way to go by foot and by bike
There's a public...
all the way along the coast.
Yeah, there's a publicly accessible, free-to-access route from end to end.
I'm a big supporter of having a safe, like, bike path, and it could be done with, like, you know, even with sea level rise, climate change, and all these issues. We can, that can be done, and I would like to see, I would like to eventually see that, and then when you're talking about on 7A, where it says required improved lateral access as a condition of new coastal development in future coastal development at the Dynegy and wastewater treatment plants, really the biggest thing on all this stuff is that Dynegy property, what's going to happen there. That's going to be like a huge part of like everything. Everything's going to kind of tie into that. But I don't know if this is the place, but that access. Let me just throw it out there, since I'm yakking a little too much, but the off ramp right there by Main, where you go down Main Street off the freeway. I was talking to a couple of friends of mine that they grew up here, and one of the access for one of the ideas was to just make a U-turn and then make a road that goes through the PG&E property and drops you off right at the Embarcadero. You could have, and then the lateral access, you could have a boatyard there where people can see boats being worked on and stuff. But that would be a one-way, and you would be able to go through Morro Bay Boulevard or there, and that's it. So I don't know if this is the place, but I just wanted to kind of throw that out there right now.
Well, I generally endorse what's here. What's not here, and what is already a significant impediment to coastal access in parts of Morro Bay is parking. It's discussed a little bit in the text. I think it needs to be a key issue. We need to figure out what to do with all those cars, whether it's parking close to the beach or whether it's a park, bike, walk, ride system. Developing that needs to be a priority. And the lack of that, in fact, is on many days during the summer has a significant impact on some of our North Morro Bay neighborhoods because of overflow street parking. So it's a access and a quality of life issue.
Regarding the parking, I would say that when we look at parking on the Embarcadero, I would like for us to look at that as a land use area, considering what is the highest and best use of that land that is closest to the water, whether it is for parking or whether it is for some other kind of access. And then as regards the California Coastal Trail, the Morro Bay Citizens Bike Committee has identified gaps in the CCT all the way from Cayucas through State Park to South Bay. And that will be coming back to council later this month as part of the unmet bike needs for Morro Bay.
In terms of this number 7, we have a question about, and I'm kind of confused, coastal access, but then under 7A, we're talking about connections along the Embarcadero. So are we only limiting it to the Embarcadero area, or are we going from north-south Morro Bay?
A good question, and coastal access would apply to the entire city.
Okay.
That particular recommendation is focused on the Embarcadero.
Got it. And so this kind of, Dr. Tefta alluded to this in terms of the parking issues and that access along the linear route from north to south Morro Bay. In terms of development of those coastal access, one idea is that north Embarcadero portion from the bridge to the end of 41, where the existing trailer park is. And But in terms of developing that piece of property or coastal access along that line, and then likewise on the North Beachcomber Road into North Morro Bay to North Point, in terms of allowing, developing access for beach access.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. Way signing, just want to make sure we have appropriate way signing for all this, both for access and identifying the California trail system. Handicap access, want to make sure that we're addressing handicap access. And I think we need to consider some of those parking spaces are handicap access for some of our seniors that don't get out of their cars, and some of those spots are just purely their access. So both handicap access, I think, we need to consider some of that, whether or not the parking is solely defined for handicap parking or not. Just want to consider that. And then we just want to piggyback on trail design. I think that whether it's trail design or bike trail design, if it's specific to the California Trail Network, that we consider that. Some of the trails, that we, as far as whether access trails through the beach areas, just make sure that we pay attention that they're not vertical trails, they're sustainable trails. And so I'll just touch on that. Thank you, John.
So under 7B, preserve and enhance vertical access points, I added and enhance horizontal access. It's nice to get a straight shot down there where two people can stand, but it's much better if you can have some horizontal access. So I added that as a component to allow for greater access along the beach once you're there. And then I, too, like others have said, I just put down safe access, which included, the points that the mayor made, and with regard to lighting and footing, and the ability for the frail elderly to be able to transgress down to the point of access.
I just have a question. I'm wondering if your comment here under 7B, provide universally accessible coastal vertical access points, are you referring to wheelchair accessible? Is that what that?
Yes.
So in essence, some of these issues could be incorporated in that.
Yes, that's a much broader way of saying many of the comments that we've heard tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, so number 8, lower cost overnight visitor accommodations. This is a focus for the Coastal Commission and a very hot topic in our state and country right now. We are looking both at lower cost and then all types of accommodations, so that would include things like short-term rentals, hotels, motels, etc. So the key things that we've brought out here tonight cover a couple of those topics, but again, as usual, we welcome your input. So 8A is to identify and codify an appropriate threshold for lower cost accommodations. So what that refers to is actually a dollar amount or some other comparable, like a range, I guess, would be something else that could be done for lower cost accommodations. And right now in the background report, you see that there is a dollar amount that we've used in there. It's at $118 and some change. So the Coastal Commission has some thoughts on how to do this as well, and we're interested in your thoughts on that. 8B is to amend your existing short-term rental regulations in the coastal zone to improve community oversight. So that's basically in almost all of the city. You do have existing regulations. You have a moratorium or a cap in place right now while this plan is being finished. So how should we move forward, basically, is what 8B is about. And then 8E is slightly on a different topic. This is where you might have a market rate or higher end facility go in, like a hotel. And the idea is to allow the public access to some portion of that facility, and so that there is a benefit to the whole community when a new accommodation goes in. And we are ready to take more input on this topic.
I guess my biggest concern is getting back to, you had a statement earlier about economic impact. I think there's a neighborhood impact of some of these things. I'm in a neighborhood like Councilperson McPherson, where we've got a lot of empty houses, and they get rented out for $450 a night, which is actually for 12 people a low cost per person. But now my neighborhood has an empty house 5 days a week. And I think that kind of impact is not in here yet. And I'm fine for invention and some people renting out spaces, but I think that's a bigger discussion in the community, is what some of these ideas would be in terms of impacts in the neighborhoods.
I agree with that last comment. And with respect to staff recommendation 8B, very short-term rental regulations by area of city, I'd like to see more specificity in this document, or delete it, because I'm afraid that's going to descend into arguments about property value and the like. So either flesh that out with what we're talking about and how we might decide that. I'd like the idea with respect to do not require short-term rental hosts to live on the rental property. I would prefer that there be some sort of penalty in terms of perhaps limitations as to the number of days they could rent out their home should they choose not to live in it, rather than an outright bar. And then finally, propose an in lieu fee to help protect low-cost accommodations. I don't know, that strikes me as just a little disingenuous in that taking the fees and what presumably to increase camping areas or something like that, I just don't think that's really addressing what we're talking about. I'd rather see something in it about new or remodeled accommodations having to set aside some portion of the property as actual low-cost, short-term rental.
Could I just ask what you had in mind when you, with that provision? The in lieu fee?
Right, the in lieu fee provision is essentially allowing, for example, if a hotel developer were to come along and wants to do a project, and the project is essentially designed as a higher end hotel product, in lieu of providing a portion of that project as a lower rate accommodation, that developer could pay an in lieu fee that then would be used for either the preservation or provision of either the preservation of existing low-cost accommodations or the provision of alternative low-cost accommodations. It's a fairly common mechanism that jurisdictions have employed to meet that requirement of the Coastal Act. So the fee would be paid by the potential developer.
I strongly agree with the neighborhood compatibility and the vacation rentals and the impacts on that. That needs to be addressed for sure. I got a question for you though. Do you, just for fun, let's say you take the wastewater treatment plant out and then we put an RV park in there, let's say. So that would be, let's say, for visitors, would they, is there a mechanism, would they, for that, could we have some kind of a bed tax or some kind of a TOT tax, or how would that work?
RV parks are required to pay TOT.
Okay.
So it's already built in. The only ones that don't are the state parks.
Oh, okay.
State park campgrounds don't have to, and we can't make them.
Okay. All right. Well, there's opportunities there. So I like that. And another thing to consider, and I'm not sure if it would work, but there's places where you can go and visit and have like tent camping, but they have pre-made tents, and then they have little heaters in there and stuff, because we have a lot of wind and stuff there, so it might be something just to ponder.
Well, there is an issue with the acceptability of some of the lower cost accommodations. All you have to do is go on Yahoo or Yelp or whatever and look at the star ratings, and everything that's above $118 a night gets 5-star. The really good ratings, and below that, it's down to about 3.2 stars or so. But if you look specifically at why the ratings are given that way, in many cases, it doesn't have to do with the building. It has to do with the two big complaints are cleanliness and staff performance. Those are the two issues. So I'm a little skeptical about the whole in lieu fee thing, because it seems like the predominant problem that's bringing down the quality of those accommodations is not related to insufficient money. It's maybe related to insufficient oversight.
Red?
I really doubt the viability of an in lieu fee. I think our experience with parking in lieu fee in Morro Bay indicates that we don't have sufficient development to build a large enough pot of money to actually accomplish anything. So I would like to strike that from the plan.
Matt? No comments? I just want my comments. I think we need to recognize that multi-generational family and short-term vacation type of housing exists in Morro Bay. We have multi-generational living arrangements and short-term vacation stays or low-income visitor stays that already exist in Morro Bay, and in some cases it's a survivability thing. So I just want to throw that out as a statement that we just need to recognize when we consider this one and even the multi-generational housing. So those are my comments. Thanks. John?
It's a tough one. Building affordable units close to the ocean often do not pencil out. But so the only thing I had alternatively to your in lieu fee would be, and I don't know if it's legal, but a differential TOT tax for units that are high end on the beach, so to speak, or on the Embarcadero, that there might be an extra 1% that could be used to offset or mitigate for lower cost kinds of development or what have you. And then the other thing I was thinking about was the development of alternative units like yurts, not necessarily large ones, but small ones, and or when you go to Cancun and you can live in outdoor condos on the beach for little dollars. Those are kind of exciting, fun, and encouraging those kinds of things. And I wouldn't call them tents, but the alternative outdoor living units.
I have a question for you. And I read this rather quickly, currently we have a sufficient number of lower affordability units, is that correct, in Morro Bay? So the question really is, moving forward, do we really need to encourage more? And I'm wondering how we do that, given, as we've just talked about, the market value here, and we'd have to encourage developers, I assume, to come in and do that. So I'm not sure what kind of incentives we could provide to ensure that we have more. And I guess that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Can we just take a short recess at this one? This would be a great time to take a recess. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kind of dial in our remarks so we can get through it. And I don't mean that in a way that we don't want to talk about this, because this is extremely important. If we need to convene another joint meeting, then that's what we'll do. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Amy and Jeff. And Jeff, thanks.
Number 9 is downtown and waterfront connections.
Mike? Okay, we got it. Okay, good.
And it focuses, we are working currently on the downtown waterfront strategic plan, so that is key recommendation 9A here. So that is already happening, and I know that a lot of you have participated in that process as well. And the other key recommendation we pulled out here is 9D, which is to create a multimodal downtown and waterfront. So that's a little bit more of a big picture goal, and we have several other recommendations we would love to hear your input on.
Michael?
I don't really have many comments, except I like the idea of a multimodal kind of flow, because I think the car downtown is going to be really challenged if we add this kind of density and infilling. We've got to come up with a better strategy for moving people around.
Let's see, two comments. Recommendation 9D, improve the pedestrian connections between the downtown, increase pedestrian appeal of downtown, the downtown district. I'd like to strengthen that language a little bit in terms of sort of redressing the imbalance of pedestrians with automobiles. Just some language to stressing the importance of making it pedestrian appealing. And there's a favorite issue of mine. I wish we could incorporate into perhaps the more general discussions of this section. I'm fascinated by the appeal of certain Italian hill towns, and what fascinates me is they have all sorts of different pavings, and the plaster is peeling, and shutters are askew, and there are electrical wires dangling randomly and all that, and people love it. Okay, so our downtown, the revitalizing of the downtown doesn't necessarily have to be with newness and all the things that we associate with everything being shipshape. It has something to do with what humans find attractive and appealing, and its scale and all that. And I just wish that would go somewhere in this. That's my comment.
Just to reiterate, I think one of the key things we could do is get the access to the to the Embarcadero a little more options. And one of them, what I already suggest, was kind of talking about, is coming off that off ramp and going through the PG&E property. And and then the other part of and kind of following up with what Joe was saying, that where we have Measure D, we have the working waterfront. People, if we had that road going through the PG&E property, have an area where people are maybe working on their boats, or a commercial, where we have a haul-out facility where people can actually see the workings part of it. That's what Morro Bay is. It's a fishing community, artist community, and it's kind of, it's unique in that respect, and keep that uniqueness. The other thing is California Department of, or the state parks, the state parks is, yeah. I want to mention that state parks using our facilities. They're using our, we need to have a little bit more, I don't know how you do it, but input with what they do, and, they're not just a customer, they're making their money, but we're kind of subsidizing them, is what I see. And that's kind of a different topic, but still, make a note.
And we're trying to keep our topic so we can keep going.
Okay.
Good, Richard.
And then the parking part of it, I think that there's opportunities for parking, like up Beach Street and in that area, where we could have the parking, a multi-level parking away and then having that pedestrian access down. Thanks.
Thanks. Red? Oh, excuse me, Bob, sorry.
I'd just say on 9A, I hope that ease of resident and visitor access includes dealing with the number of stop signs on Morro Bay Boulevard. And and then under 9E, allowing for temporary use. You know, some of the vacant and sort of untended lots on the Embarcadero really do detract from the area. So I would that needs to be stronger. It needs to be not allow but require, and perhaps that could be done with landscaping standards, or landscaping requirements for vacant lots in the Embarcadero area.
I would recommend that we build a vision of Morro Bay as a walkable community and then develop and promote that vision.
In terms of 9D, in terms of the multimodal downtown waterfront, bike paths up and down going from the downtown down to the Embarcadero and vice versa. We have a bike path from North Morro Bay that goes along Beachcomber across the bridge at the creek. If we could somehow have entry and exit points from the downtown area down onto the Embarcadero and vice versa, be those walk around, and those would be multimodal for walking, bicycle, wheelchair, etc.
Okay, kind of a question, quick comment. So on 9A, prepare and implement the downtown waterfront strategic plan. We do have a waterfront master plan. So strategic plan, different than a specific plan. So just want to insert some downtown specific plan implementation into this as well. I mean, we have a waterfront master plan. I think we should need to be looking and focusing on a downtown specific plan as well. And I'll leave it to that. John?
Thanks. Two quick comments. One, I don't know quite how to say this, but instill the novelty of an Embarcadero in the Embarcadero. And if you know what I mean, as a kid going to San Francisco, there was just the smells and the appearance and the feel, much like Joseph's comment. And then number two was the downtown and the waterfront connector. We have an existing plan that we're looking at. Just make sure that it draws people both ways, not just down from the downtown to the waterfront or Embarcadero, but vice versa, so that the design allows for that.
I would just like to make sure that the downtown waterfront strategic plan is sensitive to the weather that we have here in Morro Bay, and I'm talking specifically about the strong northwest wind and the fog in the summer, and that in terms of the way it's designed, it needs to be sensitive to those things so that it really is a usable area. I put a question mark by 9B, prepare and implement a master plan for Morro Rock, since it's a state park out there. And I don't know that the California Department of Parks and Recreation is interested at this point in developing a plan for Morro Rock. So I think even before I would include this, I would have some negotiations with them to find out their level of interest. I'd want to be really clear on exactly where their property ends and the city property begins, and otherwise I don't think I would include that. And I don't think that we can just cut off access to it. I think that was one of the suggestions or recommendations that came in the report itself. I don't think state parks would allow that. I also want to really reiterate this idea of temporary using parcels that are vacant, because I think that is just crucial and critical, and the extent to which we can do that could really spruce up the downtown area considerably.
All right, thank you. Our next topic is sea level rise resilience. As many of you may be aware, this is another one of the key focuses of updates to local coastal programs throughout the state. The California Coastal Commission is taking on the onus of implementing climate change adaptation policy related to sea level rise in local jurisdictions. We may have talked in a previous study session regarding a vulnerability assessment that's been conducted for Morro Bay that has looked at what are the potential scenarios for sea level rise for multiple future year scenarios. Based on that material, we have a variety of recommendations that have come forward. This is one where I think this is perhaps the one where we have the most, this one in historic resources, where we have the most recommendations. What we've chosen to highlight for presentation today is considering sea level rise in conjunction with new development or reuse projects. That would be a process where the general plan would include a sea level rise overlay zone that would tie to the 50-year forecasts that would identify the areas that are most likely to be inundated and then work within the zoning code to specify development requirements for those locations. 10F, managing prioritized revetments, understanding where those are occurring and prioritizing the repair or replacement or enhancement of those. 10G, monitoring beaches to recruit, train, and use volunteers to monitor beach widths over time, pursuing funding sources from government agencies to support beach monitoring, and then reporting regularly on the outcomes. And then 10H, beneficially reusing sediment from Morro Bay, determining how best to reuse dredged sediments as determined by community needs and priorities. And we'd welcome your comments on 10A through 10H.
Yeah, I think it's really critical to take these into account. I don't really have any comments on anything except that I think it's a real mistake to put serious public investment in the protection of private assets that come past this point. We want to be subsidizing bad decisions.
I'd like to see a recommendation concerning outreach to the community at large, because I think there's an erroneous notion that while sea rise may be inconvenient and our beaches may be reduced and the Embarcadero may be in terrible shape someday, I'm on higher ground and I won't be affected by it, and that's absolutely nonsense in terms of the financial consequences. So some real education and outreach that we're literally all in the same boat or lack of a boat.
I totally agree about the outreach. I've been kind of involved in this aspect of study, and even the intergovernmental panel on climate change 5 years ago. Their forecast, they realized, whoa, we way underestimated what the effects of sea level rise and climate change are gonna be. And we can really kind of go and talk for hours almost on this, but I'll just say what Commissioner Lucas said there, that we don't want to be subsidizing bad decisions. Education, let's get people thinking it's not, this is science and this is a reality. So I think that we need to, education, and then they'll be able to understand better.
I'm not sure if, in 10D, personally, I'm not sure if the idea of requiring new development to incorporate design strategies to protect against sea level is really going to work, and I'm wondering if we shouldn't just say, we're not going to build them there, just simply say, that's it. We're not going to allow, we generally don't allow many structures in a 100-year floodplain. Here we're talking about a 50-year continuous floodplain. So, and if we should elect to go with the idea of protective design, I think we need to incorporate very careful provisions to protect the city from liability. If I don't want to get the city in a situation where you've got sea level rise happening faster than expected, and people are coming in saying, "You told me this would protect my house for 50 years, and now it's gone." So that's kind of the downside of allowing them to be built there at all.
Red? I'll pass. Matt? John?
No comments.
Me too.
Measure D.
Number 11 deals with the area where Measure D applies in the North Embarcadero, the commercial fishing zoning district. We are including the 3 recommendations here, 11A, which would task the city with figuring out if there's a way to clarify the meaning of clearly incidental uses under Measure D. And I think it's safe to say without putting Measure D back on the ballot. 11C would be to assist the commercial fishing industry to adapt to climate and economic change. And 11D, prioritize needed commercial fishing industry infrastructure and facilities in terms of the city role.
I don't have much to say about this, except I really want to endorse 11D. I think it's critical. We don't have very many places that we have flexibility to accommodate the kinds of things that the fishing industry have, and I think it's really critical that we not lose opportunities with them.
I would oppose any idea of trying to achieve clarification by putting it on the ballot for fear that something unexpected might happen and that ballot measure might be defeated. So I would seek some other way of getting, I personally think there's sufficient clarity in the measure, but if we required clarity, then maybe through some zoning provisions and examples, but I would not risk the proposition of putting it on a ballot.
Yeah, I feel it's pretty clear myself. The Measure D is the way it is to me, my opinion. And then also on the Maritime Museum and the marine storage, that's an area where I feel that's we could the power plant property is a good area for them.
I'd simply say that I think that Measure D does need to be clarified, and I have been approached by the Harbor Advisory Board with the idea of the Planning Commission and the Harbor Advisory Board sort of working together on some of these issues in 11A and 11D, and so we might be able to provide you some more input moving forward on that.
I would recommend that we use the zoning regulation to clarify the Measure D provisions.
And that's kind of, Scott, this is my question to you in terms of clarifying that zoning. Is that an issue for Measure D for the general plan, or is that more of the zoning conversation that will happen later?
I'll try to answer that question. I think really what we're looking at is there is some uncertainty as to what Measure D means. We have the way that we've been interpreting it over time. A lot of information, resides in our harbor department as it relates to that. And sort of memorializing that through this general plan and LCP update process is what we're trying to do. So while we're not trying to reinvent what it says or anything else, we're trying to come up with an interpretation that we can follow so we can consistently apply that interpretation over time, because I would say that we probably, at least arguably, have not done that in the past. at least over long periods of time. And so that's what we're trying to do, is say, hey, this is what we think it means, and this is where we want to go with it. I think that's pretty much it.
That's a great clarification. And then the two things I would add to 11D in terms of those prioritizations is the term working waterfront. That's been coming up a number of times in terms of clarifying, not just this includes the Measure D area, but the Embarcadero, but working waterfront is important to put in there. And then also, in terms of looking at this number 11, in terms of the economic development aspects of the working waterfront / Measure D, those wordings or semantical uses would be useful in terms of strengthening it. That's it.
John?
So the only comment I have is with regard to 11C, assist the commercial fishing industry to adapt to climate and economic change. I don't know that we want to select any specific business sector and offer mitigation economically with regard to this plan. I don't see how it fits. I don't see the fairness aspect of it with regard to other business sectors, and thusly I would remove that in terms of having any economic impact that might affect the city's general fund and or any of the city's finances.
I would agree with John on that point. I think that's a very important point, that we can't really single out one industry to help to adapt to climate change. I happened to catch the Planning Commission meeting where you were talking about Measure D, and I know there is disagreement about the extent to which the language should be clarified to especially this incidental uses. And I know that the other side of the argument is that you need to have some flexibility when you're looking at particular applications, because the fishing industry could change and they need to be able to adapt. So I would just be sensitive to whatever language is used is allowing for changes within the industry, which may mean different kinds of businesses may need to locate there.
I just have one quick question for you on Measure D for staff. It was just prompted by Joe. Thank you. So having Measure D in this element, if it went to the ballot, then if it actually did go to the ballot and was repealed somehow, that would eliminate an element in this document. Is that correct, or how does this work right here?
So you're saying if it went to the...
If there was a Measure D element or something like that, and it went in there, so that would kind of remove all that, anything in there. Isn't that correct?
Well, I mean, I guess if that was the measure that you took to the people was we want to remove and repeal Measure D, and that was it, and not put anything else back in its place,
sure,
then this wouldn't mean anything, because it would be related to something that no longer exists. And we would just follow the regular zoning that we would have in that location.
Sure.
Yeah.
But if a measure went to the ballot that says, hey, we like Measure D, but we want to add clarity on this language, then it would go in here.
It would depend on whether it conflicted with the language that's in the general plan or not.
And if it failed, this would still stay. Measure D would stay the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, number 12 is environmentally sensitive habitat areas, and the two key issues. So again, this is of interest to the Coastal Commission, required by the Coastal Commission. And 12A, the key recommendation there would be to do a comprehensive update to the city's ESHA map. It's been a long time since that's happened, and that is something that the city has gotten funding to do. So that will happen in the near future. And 12B is to foster and develop public-private partnerships to protect natural resources. And that's it. Yep. Didn't have a page turn. So please let us know your thoughts on those and the other recommendations in this section.
My only concern is I think it's fine. I'd almost like another section where we talk about the capacity to identify places that would actually be restorative or even regenerative rather than just protected. You know, it talks about we have what we need, and I think that we could actually be proactive in returning things back to a wilder state and in an intentional manner. And I think it's a huge benefit to the residential value as well as the ecological value.
Frequently in the Planning Commission meetings, the issue of, I admit this is specific, but eelgrass remediation has come up, and the ineffectual activities of individual property owners in their restoration efforts. And we've talked about designating some area in the bay where eelgrass might actually thrive and where we could actually send resources rather than individuals putting their resources into eelgrass where it's unlikely to survive. So I think it's sufficiently important to the health of the bay that maybe something about a designated eelgrass remediation area be included in the recommendations.
I love that idea. Like an eelgrass bank is great. The other thing is I think it's way long overdue is that we need to start identifying where, like, these no-name creeks and, you know, this kind of stuff is ridiculous. You know, we need to have the ESHA accurately defined, so then when we are looking at some development, we know the buffer is this and that, you know, so that's a priority.
Well, I'll just agree with what's been said so far, and just point out that the updating of the ESHA map is maybe something that has to be done more frequently than the general plan, because creeks meander and such.
I have no further comment.
John?
So one of the things that I would consider adding, maybe under 12B would be, and 12C, would be consider the development of further partnerships with Cal Poly and or other educational organizations that are studying the issue of runoff and natural habitat changes. And so I know our aquarium project envisions that as a component, but I think that would be important to include since we have such a viable partner right next door.
I noticed that you did have a discussion about hunting in the bay and decided not to include any kind of a recommendation relative to it. I'm just wondering if there is some way that we can raise that issue, even if it just involves studying the impact of hunting in the bay or something, or re-examining the areas where it's allowed. I think there's significant community support to really try to ban it. I realize that it's not our decision to make, but we certainly can make our voices heard. And that, to me, is a huge, has a huge impact on our natural environment, and not to mention that it's dangerous. So that's my 2 cents worth.
If I might add, perhaps something having, addressing the effect of events on ESH, such as fireworks and other athletic events. Not other, but fireworks and athletic events.
All right, thank you. Moving to number 13, this is transportation metrics. Brief summary on this, I alluded to it earlier, is recent state legislation, Senate Bill 743, has established essentially a requirement for the California Environmental Quality Act that evaluating transportation impacts using traditional methods such as level of service, where roadway segments or intersections are graded A, B, C, D, E, F based on their performance, largely from a congestion perspective, that practice is no longer to be used as a means of determining whether or not a project has an impact on the environment. A city or county can continue to use level of service to talk about roadway performance, and can continue to use level of service to, for example, collect roadway impact fees relative to roadway performance. But a jurisdiction can no longer use level of service as a means of saying a project has an impact on the environment. In lieu of level of service, the legislation talks about the need for jurisdictions to evaluate the impact of a project on the environment from a transportation perspective with regard to the way that it would potentially affect greenhouse gas emissions, potential for infill development, potential to degrade air quality, and directed the Office of Planning and Research to recommend metrics and thresholds that jurisdictions could use to do that. The Governor's Office of Planning and Research has, at this point, recommended vehicle miles traveled as an alternative means to discuss the impact of a project on the environment from a transportation perspective. That becomes important for our consideration in the general plan, because the general plan is, we believe, an appropriate place to begin to have that conversation about what those standards ought to be going into the future. The Governor's Office of Planning and Research recommendations are talking about an approximately 15% reduction from existing VMT levels in the future as a means of establishing a potential threshold that you would use to evaluate future projects under CEQA. The recommendation that is contained here contains multiple parts, and on this one I actually kind of want to go through the staff recommendations that are proposed. There's 13A, which is to continue to establish vehicular level of service standards as a means, then those would be established essentially within the general plan. 13B, to establish multimodal LOS standards, which would consider not just vehicular standards, and that these multimodal standards could be either supplemental to the vehicular standards or as a replacement for the vehicular standards. And then 13C, to establish VMT thresholds. And I think there's a variety of means we could do that with. Those could come into the context of the general plan themselves, or there could be general plan policy that essentially directs the city to establish those thresholds. Either way, in a number, essentially shortly, and those provisions of the law have not taken full effect yet. We're waiting for the final guidelines from OPR. Following those final guidelines, there'll be a rulemaking process. It could be 2 to 3 years before those take effect, and it's likely that there will be a grace period at the beginning of that time. But considering that you're in a comprehensive general plan update, we very much feel now is the time to begin having those conversations and potentially embedding that in your general plan. So with that, we'll take comments on 13A, B, and C.
I'll pass.
This strikes me as a good idea. I'm just wondering the financial burden of establishing these standards. Any idea, and who bears them?
Ultimately, that is the responsibility. Establishing the standards is the responsibility and burden of the city.
And any idea of the cost of establishing that? I mean, is it insignificant, serious? I mean, I have no idea.
I would say there's advantage to doing some of the work as part of the general plan update, because there's a comprehensive traffic study that's being conducted to support this process. It'll provide a lot of the data that's necessary to do that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but on the level of service, as if you compare it to the vehicle miles traveled, is it like level of service is more subjective and the vehicle mile travel is more quantitative? Is that a fair statement?
Actually, both are qualitative analyses that are compared to established quantitative thresholds. I mean, the answer to the question is they're both quantitative analyses.
Okay.
Yeah. They measure inherently different things.
Okay.
The level of service talks about, for example, how congested is a roadway segment or an intersection.
But the grading would be subjective, right? Where vehicle mile traveled is like that's numbers, right?
And the grades are objective. They're based on established standards and ratios, and the performance of the roadway is measured against those ratios.
Okay.
And then compared to the established metrics for A, B, C, D, and E. Those are the same. A, B, C, D, and E are the same everywhere.
Okay.
What your standard is, what the city chooses to make its standard for this is acceptable or not, varies.
Okay.
City to city to city.
Okay, got it. Thank you
You're welcome.
for that. That said, I'm for proactive, doing it proactively. If that's where it's going, let's get a jump on it.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking for the other half of this policy, which is, I get establish the standards. So, but then the question is, so what do you do if the standards aren't met? In other words, if a project would cause the LOS standard to be exceeded, is it denied? Do you require mitigation? If we have intersections that exist that do not meet the LOS, do we then have a plan to improve them so that they do meet LOS? It's like, yeah, we got the standards, but we also need to have the policies saying this is what we do based on those standards.
I strongly urge that we develop multimodal LOS standards because if we reduce VMT, then we're going to be using alternative transportation modes.
I just ask that we have the SLOCOG staff visit some of this and just have them weigh in on some of the technical part for us as well, so that consistency amongst neighbors. John?
Yeah, I generally support establishing the thresholds.
I really just have a question. In these standards, do you take into account energy-efficient vehicles when you're looking at vehicle miles traveled?
It is a consideration, yes. It's a consideration in the modeling.
It is, okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, next topic, time check. It is 8:25, and we have 14, 15, 16, 14. We have 3 to go.
Three to go.
What's your pleasure?
So we can wrap this up, and like I say, I don't want to rush through this, but I think we can, if we can just focus on our the issues and our comments, we can get through that. So.
Very well. Then we'll continue to number 14, which is historic resource management. This is also one that was the topic of considerable discussion, I think, within the community at large, at the GPAC, in multiple settings. We've heard about historic resource management in almost every setting that we've had a workshop or a survey or some other form of community engagement on this project. What we have before you as staff recommendations is, and you'll notice a little bit of difference between the list of policy options that was presented to the GPAC and the perhaps more abbreviated list or other options that are presented to the Planning Commission and Council. The options begin with becoming a certified local government, and these are essentially presented in the steps in the order that they would be taken to implement a fully functional resource or historic resource management program. They're presented in a way where you could go as far down that list as funding and staffing and community desire would enable. And you would be implementing at least the first stages of a historic resource management program. The first of which is becoming a certified local government. The second, developing a historic context statement that essentially defines what is valuable in terms of history and architecture in Morro Bay. Third, conducting a cultural resources inventory to go out into the community and inventory the resources that are present. And fourth, potentially to establish a local register, which is 14D, which would supplement the state and federal registers at the local level for identifying additional resources that may not be present in the state or the federal register from a local perspective. There's a number of other options here, including Mills Act program, design guidelines for historic buildings, and an adaptive reuse ordinance that would be likely implementation steps from that point forward. So they're all here and all presented, just recognizing as you go further down that list, it does introduce additional staff time and resource burdens. So we'll welcome your comments on 14A through 14G.
I think it's a great idea to have a cultural context statement. The prehistoric resources are continually ignored by a lot of the people in the community when they buy a property, and I think something that makes that more aware. This is going to mean 45 years goes back into the 60s now. So there's a lot of, it's not just the older structures, it's a lot of the structures that people would say are not necessarily beautiful structures that could come under these types of controls and protection. And so I think you have to be very careful. Protection by historic designation both is an opportunity to tap funding vehicles for some sources, but it's also an obligation that prohibits one from developing things in certain ways. So I would say when we're looking at the nature of the downtown, it's a real two-edged sword. And I'd be very cautious in how we move on anything other than a kind of a general statement. I think it's great to have incentives to consider it, but I've seen too many examples in far more historic areas than we have here where these things can be negatives as well.
I think it's a great idea and an early step in terms of building a preservation sense in the community. I'd like to suggest a recommendation that a volunteer committee be formed. I'm impressed with the quality of the human resources in the community, and perhaps they could have the responsibility of the register and the inventory and maybe even guidelines, but community involvement, save a little expense.
Maybe we could include like iconic buildings in there as well.
Yeah, I support the concept as long as we can pick our way and not create something that's too onerous.
I fully support this element, and I hope that we could count on the resources of the Historic Society of Morro Bay to help us develop the program.
I think in terms of the larger concept of the general plan, I think this is a perfect addition in terms of establishing the city in the historical context.
I'd just like to echo the comments of making it too onerous as well. Thanks.
I'd like to re-echo the comments about making it too onerous as well. And I worry about the consumption of city staff resources in doing this. And I like the idea about the volunteer organizations being involved. I'm just really concerned about overburdening staff and also duplicating anything that's done at the state level. I just don't think there's a need to be redundant with regard to that. And those are my comments. Thanks.
I too support the idea of this. I'm concerned about the resources that might be required to actually do it. I notice it says completing these steps will require allocation of city resources in excess of current practice. So we just had a really serious meeting about how we're expecting reduced revenues in the future. So I think we have to be really careful, and it would have to be prioritized among other things that we want to do. I think we need to really support the Historical Society in Morro Bay. They've been the ones that have really worked hard at doing this, and if they want to take on some of this responsibility, that would be great, because as a concept and idea, I fully support it, and I think it would be great to have a historic context statement. That's what I have to say.
Okay, number 15, parking. Almost last but not least. So we've got 3 key recommendations that we're highlighting here. 15A would be to modify minimum and establish maximum parking requirements. So that's a 2-part recommendation. 15B, if warranted, implement paid parking. So that would mean studying whether it's warranted, and it may be different in different areas of the city, and then how would that implementation look? And then 15C would be to expand the in lieu fee program.
I'm going to pass on this one.
This is complicated, involved. Certainly in theory, I agree with what I'm reading. I'm fine with it, pending further evaluation.
I think that we should have metered parking on the Barcadero, and then maybe a program for passes that for people that work there. Maybe have a way that they can get a pass and maybe park someplace else, like up on the hill or something. But yeah, I think that there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, I think in many areas, in some areas of town, the whole concept of on-site parking just doesn't make sense. I think oceanfront parking is probably not the best use of that. I think that one thing I would add, I would consider establishing parking districts, which would be then responsible for providing shared parking in certain areas of town. I would support paid parking because Scott tells me it's the only efficient way to limit the length of time that people stay in one particular spot. And there are ways to do it now that don't require the rows of parking meters. So that's my take.
I support a discussion of implementing a paid parking program. I do oppose the in lieu parking fee. I find that to be punitive and of no real benefit in adding parking, which I think we're probably looking to reduce anyway. And I do support parking benefit districts as a way of gaining revenue to support neighborhood goals.
I'm in support of this parking ideas you brought up. Although one thing you suggest to add is develop a parking plan that would develop a flow pattern through the city that would promote pedestrian and bicycle usage.
How many comments, John?
Thank you. I do support the plan. 2 comments. One, I think there should be included an economic funding analysis above and beyond in lieu parking and paid parking that would anticipate the city's ability and possibilities of funding parking structures in the future and based on need. And 2, I do support paid parking as a way to reduce and mitigate parking issues. Thanks.
I don't know if I support paid parking or not. I think this is an issue that really needs community input. I think that there's a large number of people in the community that would object strongly to that, and I think we need to take into consideration residents versus tourists when we talk about parking. So it's my understanding that we're developing a parking plan. Is this the parking plan, or is that a separate plan, Scott?
This is a portion of it.
This is a portion of it.
This is a portion of the discussion, yes.
Okay, okay. And am I right that we did just reduce the parking in lieu fees?
We did. We effectively suspended the parking in lieu fee program, reducing, you get the first floor for free, and then it's $500 a space after that.
Right.
And there's various triggers for different levels of review between staff, planning commission, and city council.
Okay. So really, your idea of an economic analysis of this and its impact on economic development would be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, our final issue is view sheds and viewpoints. This is something that is in your existing general plan in terms of information and discussion of scenic views and vistas and official designations, but there are no officially designated view sheds within the city of Morro Bay currently. So 16A would recommend that. And 16B would be to create view shed protection guidelines. And oftentimes this key issue comes into play in the CEQA process. So we are looking for your input on the recommendations for 16.
I think these are some of the things that we can do collectively that really show what we believe. This is a huge impact in terms of the people who haven't come here very often before, and the first impression that you get, and it codifies some of the values that people who want to stay here really appreciate. I think it's incredibly complicated. I have no concept of how you're going to pull this off in terms of the regulations, but I think as a concept, I think it's absolutely fascinating. The only thing I would say is, I think especially as we're considering the downtown, those linear streetscapes that point to the bay ought to somehow have some kind of designation as well, so that you're moving to the west and you're looking down those streetscapes and see the rock and you see the, I think those are worthy of some kind of discussion in here too.
Perhaps this is where my earlier suggestion about second stories in the residential areas, and that it should not be a all or nothing proposition in terms of approving a second story. Maybe there should be a consideration in the sense of sharing the view with only occupying half of the second story surface.
I kind of like to have a view shed protection area, kind of like where you go by the cloisters off the highway. You know, they limited that to, I think, 2 stories, or was at least, I think initially it was tree height, and anyway, that kind of worked out so you could see. The other thing is that I think that we should, I feel it's a safety issue is utilities, overhead utilities. I've been on call-outs before during storms, and those wires whipping around. I mean, it's just dangerous. So if part of the climate change, climate change issue, I think for safety, bringing utilities underground is not only just visually it'd be nicer, but I think we move in that direction. It'd be great.
I think what we've dealt with mostly in the past is the big views, from the top of Black Hill, that can be mapped. But I think a crucial thing about Morro Bay is all of the little small views. When you're walking down a street you've never been before, and you look and there's a big, beautiful view of the back bay. And I think somehow we have to begin to deal with those too, because I think those are as essential elements of neighborhood character as the architecture of the houses that are there.
Could I just add one thing, please? It'll be very short. Thank you. The lighting thing, I think, we have a night sky ordinance. We ought to respect that. And one of the things that I find personally assaulting to my eyes is the lights, some of the lights, street lights that they have now, the blue. It's like I used to run welding crews, and that frequency of light is just bad. I think that we should even have something that we can kind of not so assaulting, not so offensive.
Red? I would like to say that I regard one of our most precious and valuable views is the harbor. That is a view that is unique in all of San Luis Obispo County. And I am concerned that bulky buildings and two-story buildings on the Embarcadero on the water side degrade that view, and that is something I would like to note in the plan, something that's worthy of discussion.
I concur with so much of what has been said. One thing I'd like to add in terms of 16A, designating official view sheds, in terms of enhancing and developing the visitor and resident experience and protecting that.
I concur with Commissioner Lucas's comments.
So I think this is critically important. I would also add to what my colleague, Mr. Davis, talked about in terms of viewshed protection, the sand spit, which is a unique entity, and the protection of that view corridor, I think, is extremely important. And then I don't know if I saw it here, but just signage, height-limited signage, so it didn't impede views, but signage that would assist one in determining where one can find the best views, and/or mapping. So, thank you.
Yeah, I would just also add the view shed that's off towards Cayucas, the Chevron property, which is a absolutely gorgeous view, and I don't know if that's in our planning area, if we can at least include that as a view shed we would like to protect. So.
Thank you. We made a lot of progress tonight, and I know I, for one, feel like we got a lot of good and very diverse input tonight. Just to summarize then, next steps for our process, we're using all of the input that you gave us tonight to go through and continue to fine-tune these and begin to turn them into policy language that would appear then into the draft general plan and LCP. In the form of the green print and blueprint that have been described as part of our work program. That's really the key destination for a lot of this stuff. Some of what we've discussed, particularly in terms of the planning area discussion, we'll be returning to when we come back to you in March with land use recommendations based on the alternatives discussions that we have with the General Plan Advisory Committee and the broader community. So to that extent, this input will be affecting the land use plan and the alternatives as well. That concludes our presentation for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks for everybody's work. We're up at 8:50, and a public comment at this point. Thank you very much. and so deserving. Public comment is open. I'm so proud of you all. And the comment for those who didn't hear was, "I'm so proud of you all for your work," from Mr. Silway. So thanks very much. With that, unless there's a request for closing remarks by anyone, I'm just thanks for everybody. Thanks for your work. Appreciate our planning commission and their work and all the work tonight. Thanks.
Thanks to the GPAC as well for all of their input and work.
Thank you.
I just appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. And with that, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.